Hey everybody, I hope you're all having a great new year. We're going to do something a little bit different today. Over the last 2014 year, I've had lots of questions related to my MVVM videos that I've not had a chance to really go back and answer. So today we're going to do that in kind of a Q&A format. I've selected about 15 or so good questions that I thought were useful, that would prove to be useful to others out there. So let's go ahead and dig right in to the first question. And if I mispronounce the name of anybody that asks these questions, I do apologize ahead of time. So the first question is from Darren Harrison. And he basically says, awesome explanations of how this stuff works. Have had some issues finding a good source, but now I have. Question, what if you wanted to have multiple views in the main window, but split out into different view models, commands, etc., and have them interact with each other? Thanks a ton for the videos. This is an excellent question because when you start to build a MVVM application that's more complex than your basic CRUD app, you're going to have multiple view models. They're going to have to communicate with one another. It's just inevitable when your application gets big enough. And it doesn't take that long for your application to get that big where it's required. I mean, even in the smallest of MVVM applications, you may have something you're trying to accomplish that requires this. So it's just something that you're going to have to deal with. But a good way to deal with this is it's okay and acceptable for a parent view model to own child view models and expose them. So what that might look like is, in this example, we have a abstract base class view model. It just has a simple header string property that the view would data bind to and display as a text value. We have a navigation view model, which might be in an application where I have kind of a navigation control panel on the left-hand side, and then maybe on the right-hand side I have kind of like a document view where I could display a document, control pagination, and things like that. So I'll have a document view model for that. So what this might look like is my shell view model, which represents my main window, will basically take those as dependencies, and in this example, we're using constructor injection. And we're just going to take those as dependencies and assign them to two properties. So we have a property for navigation, and we have a property for document. So you notice we still have no view-specific code in our view model. Now what that might look like in the XAML is we're going to have our parent window class, which will of course, for the data context, utilize our shell view model. But then each major section of the view, in this case I have one grid that will represent the area for the navigation, will data bind its data context to that navigation property exposed by the shell view model. And then same thing happens for the data context for displaying the document. So that's a perfectly valid way to accomplish it. There's other ways to accomplish it. You can do it through pure XAML, you can do it through pure code. It's up to you, and ultimately you're going to have to identify your requirements, which will determine a lot about the approach that you'll take. Another example with this is you may not want to have a kind of a persistent state for the view model. You know, in this example, this data context is always going to be bound to the same instance of the navigation property on the shell view model. Now, depending on your application, you may want to have a fresh instance of navigation depending on what happens in your application. So your code may look slightly different to facilitate that. Ultimately, this is one way you can accomplish that. And yes, it's valid to expose different parts of your applications into children view models. Okay, next question from WebDart. Thank you for the video, but is it normal for MVVM to create a view in the view model? Absolutely not. So when I did that originally, it was in MVVM session 1, I believe, where I demonstrated how to just show a simple, I think, as message box or another view. That was kind of outside the scope of that video, which is why I just kind of quickly did that. In a more production type of application, you really want to communicate with additional views through something like a dialog or a view service. So in this example, we have again a shell view model class, and it takes, again through dependency injection, a instance of iDialog service, which would have some concrete implementation. In your typical MVVM application, your concrete implementation would just be a dialog service that knows how to display other WPF dialogues, windows, or it might be something, if you have a view service, that would know how to return back a XAML partial view or user control. But essentially, we're going to take that in as a dependency, store that, and then let's say we have an application where we click a search button and we want to show a search dialog. We're going to expose a show search screen command. And ultimately, the private implementation will just call in the dialog service and say, show me the dialog that's mapped to a new instance of a search screen view model. So this is the pattern that I use in my applications, where I have this iDialog service that has a show dialog method that takes a generic type of view model as a type parameter. And in this case, I'm saying, show me search screen view model. Now, before you get to this point, somewhere in your application, you need to do some registrations. There's a dialog service.register search screen view model, and I will map that to some type of XAML view. In my case, it would be a search screen view dialog. So that way, when I request this view model down the road, it already knows what it's mapped to, and it will return both a new instance of the view model and a new instance of the view, and it will display that accordingly. Vice versa, if I wanted to specify an existing view model, I can create an instance of view model that I control, and I can pass that in as a parameter. Now, the point of this is you're abstracting out the view specific code from a view model, so there's no WPF framework code in here, and you're programming just against an interface. It doesn't care what the concrete implementation is, which means that for unit testing, you can abstract this out into something where you're not actually working with a UI, which facilitates testing much better. So that's one way to approach it. There's other methods like messaging services and things like that. But ultimately, you want to do something that abstracts it out of the view model. Okay, next question. This one is pretty good. I actually dealt with this exact scenario 2 years ago at my day job. So for my Carby, this is really good, clear tutorial. Thanks. We're looking to move all of our development away from WinForms, C#, EF over to WPF for a number of reasons. Mainly to move into the Windows 8 phone arena, and secondly to get reliable bound data form experience. So here I'm assuming he's talking about the two-way data binding that WPF provides, whereas data binding in Windows Forms is a little bit more cumbersome. Would you consider posting a tutorial on binding using MVVM and the Entity Framework, but not code first? We develop real-world software where the database is already in production, so we always use database first entities. I'm not sure how to implement iNotify property change to model, and we don't have full access to the generated entities. Would you modify the T4 templates to implement the interface? So, big question. So, I work at a company that builds banking software, and our flagship product is a large classic ASP web application backed by numerous .NET services. And one of my first tasks that I was assigned with when I was a consultant for the company was to come in and build Entity Framework, build a data layer, and kind of get some progress moving in that direction. Now, the approach that I had taken at the time was I took database first, because the database in your scenario was 120 some odd database tables, another 100 some odd stored procedures, and 100 and some odd plus views. It wasn't practical for me to sit down and take a code first approach where I write all the objects by hand. So a database first approach is absolutely necessary, especially when you may not understand the whole database. If it's very large, you're going to have to take that approach. Now, the other reason that you want to do that is because it is a pain to keep the entities in sync with the database. In our case, we actually use a Visual Studio database project to make all of our database changes and to keep that and manage it. So that's where all of our database changes happen. And then updating the Entity Framework objects basically just becomes a second-hand thing where we update it against the database. Now, in our case, we actually had taken those entities that were generated from the T4 template originally, and we removed those from the T4 template and just put them in the DLL. And then what that allowed us to do is things like automatically generate GUID values in the constructors, do some type of validation that we wanted. We were able to extend the objects a little bit. The challenge that provided with us is we lost the capability to keep the objects in sync using T4 templates. So every time a database change happened, we had to modify the objects by hand. So I regret that, and we would not take that same approach again. So the approach that we do recommend is exactly what you're kind of going down the road on, is do the database first approach. I would never do a code first approach for an existing database. It's just kind of a pain when you have a large database. Let the T4 template generate those objects, but don't modify them to implement things like iNotify property change. Leave them as is, because you want your database synchronization between the entity, the EDMX basically, and the database to be very straightforward and automated. So what you would do instead is you would create a facade. So let's, in this example, say I have a customer entity generated from a T4 template by the Entity Framework Design Database First Tools. I'm going to wrap that in a class called Customer Facade, and that is what will implement iNotify property changed. It's going to wrap the customer entity, and I'm going to expose the properties that I only care about for the view model. So in this case, just name. If I had other things like email or password, and I did not need those in this particular view, I wouldn't expose them. And this is the object where I'm going to raise property changed. I would never modify the entity itself. I would keep that as pristine as possible. Now, if you really need to modify your entity, you can create a partial class instead and do your modifications there. So basically, you'd have a partial class customer that implements iNotify property changed, which would allow you to have your partial, and you're still leaving the T4 template generated code completely alone. So you can do that. I don't recommend it because, again, I like to keep the entity, the data layer objects clean, and there's performance implications, although it might be small, of iNotify property change that we don't want in the data layer. So that's one approach to take. Now, what I've found is that oftentimes you end up adding a lot of properties to these facade objects to track view state, which ultimately you pretty much end up having a customer view model. So one example on the user interface, I might create a new customer and maybe it hasn't been persistent to the database yet. So I might have an isNew property, and then that isNew property would raise property change notification. So that way I could take action in the view. So if I have a new customer, I might display a new customer form. If it's not a new customer, I might display different fields. So ultimately, customer facades are great for really simple scenarios where you just kind of need to expose some field values. But when you start getting into a situation where you need to add additional properties and methods and commands, ultimately you're going to end up with a customer view model. So that's where I would do the work. Don't modify your data layer objects to facilitate MVVM. Keep them separate. It's a little bit more work, but you'll benefit from the returns in the end, especially in testability, where you're going to want to unit test, the change notification and methods and commands on the facade, whereas you don't need those types of unit tests on your data layer. So hopefully that answers the question. Again, at the end of the day, in terms of the database stuff, I would always prefer database first, especially for large databases. Code first is nice, but I found it works well for simple projects. I do know there's companies out there and teams using code first on large databases. At the end of the day, it's more of a team preference. So do what's agreeable with your team. Okay, from Raman Mahmoodi. Move on, David. We were all waiting for the next videos. By the way, your UI tests are always hitting the database. Should this really be a unit test with some mocking for the business context to avoid database interaction? Once again, great work. Looking forward to more of these videos. Would it be possible to reuse the view models for a mobile front end? So two different questions here. So the first question about hitting the database. As we get further into the Enterprise MVVM series, yes, we will cover mocking and stubbing. To start with, we just won't. Now, there's one important implication of using Entity Framework, though, as an ORM with this pattern. And this is a pretty large debate. And one of the reasons for not mocking when using Entity Framework is because when you mock it out, you're not really testing much of anything. Let me give you an example. I have a foreign key, a one-to-one relationship in my database. When I mock Entity Framework out, I lose the actual underlying database behavior. I may still have the behavior of Entity Framework itself, but I lose the underlying SQL Server behavior. So while the unit test might pass because I've mocked it out and my scenario is perfect, if something is wrong with the database, that's going to fail in production. So it's a very good reason not to mock out your data layer itself. Now, once you start to get into more of the application layer where you already have that all integration tested, and in our case, with the company I work for, we have a data layer, which is basically the entity framework and all of our entities and our data context. And then on top of that, we have a business context, which is the same pattern we use in this enterprise MVVM series. And that still is integration tested because it's still technically a lot of data access. And our business rules are still strongly coupled to the database. It's like, this field is required, this field must be this long, this field must look like this field must be related to this. It's still all kind of data access at the end of the day. And it's much more useful to integration test that behavior. Now, once that's all integration tested and we get into the application layer where I'm utilizing the API instead of building the API, then I will mock it out completely at that point because I already have the confidence and knowledge that it's already integration tested in the previous layers. So it's not really until you get to the application layer that you really mocking and stubbing becomes substantially useful. Now again, you can choose to do mock it out, and that's going to have to be a decision that you take with your team. But ultimately, if you do that, the gain you get from mocking it out is obviously performance of your unit tests. You can run all your unit tests very, very quickly, but you need to also evaluate the cons that come along with it. Okay, your second question, would it be possible to reuse the view models for a mobile frontend? Yes, I recommend using a portable class library. It's built for that reason. What that does is it forces you to use the subset of the .NET framework that's supported in more of a cross-platform way. So it's going to tell you how, you can't use things that are not cross-platform basically. So if I want to reuse a view model for both WPF and Windows Phone, a portable class library will force me to do so because I don't have full access to the .NET framework in that scope. There's also tooling. I'm not sure if I've never used a portable class library personally because I don't do any mobile development, but I believe there's also tooling that will analyze your existing projects and tell you how cross-platform compatible they are and what portions of your code you would need to make compatible. So other than that, yes, because it was common back when Silverlight was big to reuse WPF view models and Silverlight view models. So yes, it's possible. A little bit more work. You lose out on some functionality sharing them that way, but I'm sure you can. One thing you could probably do is have a view model that's fairly generic to the technologies and maybe have specific interface implementations that get injected in for the specific, WPF concrete implementations and Silverlight concrete implementations. So you might be able to handle it that way. Okay. Next question from Kick Notes. Good video. I think WPF and MVVM is great, but I'm always a bit turned off by the amount of standard scaffolding required for command handling without using something like routing command or a framework like Caliburn Micro. Nonetheless, good video. Watch for others. So this is an interesting question. I personally, and I forget the guy's name, but he works at Microsoft and he's a big MVVM advocate, does a lot of video content as well. I agree with him. I don't find myself needing MVVM frameworks. I have some basic things like a base view model class that implements change notification. I have my action command, which you can also know as relay command or delegate command or other terms that other frameworks use. And there's other things that I'm sure would be useful out there, but those basic things can go a long way with MVVM software. We've built some decent sized MVVM applications at my workplace. Now, to coincide with what I just said, there's things that like Microsoft Expression has frameworks that make UI events easier, so that way you don't have to code in the code behind. But again, the goal of MVVM is not to eliminate code behind, it's to separate your view from your logic. It's still perfectly valid to have code in your code behind. So something as simple as like, let's say I have a WPF control that doesn't support a command binding, like a button. It has a command property and I can bind to iCommand implementation. Let's say I have a list view with a right-click event. It's rather silly to write 100 lines of code and use a framework to implement that functionality just to avoid writing code in your code behind, when in fact I can write one line of code in my code behind for that click event that talks to an interface to do the same thing, and I'm still accomplishing the separation of concerns between my view and my logic. So I want you to think about that in a different way. Having code behind is not a bad thing, but you definitely do not want application logic in your code behind. You want it to be view-specific code. So next question from RxDMD1. So the focus now is really on testing. There is so much time involved in it that it takes most of the development time as in your tutorials. I'm not saying it's not important, but development becomes a drag because of it. Too much emphasis on testing rather than writing the actual layers along with explanation. I think it's easier to follow the tutorial if the testing is done after creating the layers. The tutorial should be testing data and business layers, by the way. How is EF involved here? So this is a really good question, but you have to ask yourself, the whole purpose of MVVM to begin with is, one, to separate your concerns, your view and your logic. But a huge benefit that gives you is testability. If you're not really thinking in a test-first fashion, I would argue, yes, there's a lot of benefits you can get from MVVM by itself without test-driven development, but it's kind of silly not to do TDD at the same time. The whole kind of context of my enterprise MVVM videos is to cover the whole spectrum, which includes test-driven development. So if test-driven development isn't really what you're interested in, then the enterprise MVVM videos might not necessarily be the content that you're looking for. There's bits and pieces in those videos you might find interesting, but the focus is on TDD with MVVM. And I'll give you a good example. We have at our workplace a data layer. Again, the database itself is about 100 plus database tables. So our business layer has about 100 functions. And those functions add data to the database and have business rules and things like that. And actually, out of those 100 functions, what we actually have implemented right now is about 20 of them. And those 20 functions are backed by over 600 automated integration tests. And the benefit that you get with that is substantial. There's no possible way any person on the team can remember all 600 different scenarios that would need to be tested every time a piece of code changes. So having that automated test framework is absolutely crucial. And especially when you get in your application layer, there's no way every developer can understand every aspect of your application either, unless it's a very small app. And again, having that framework of 1,000 unit tests that test your application as a whole is substantially beneficial, because you don't have to manually test your program every time. As long as you have confidence in your test framework, you could rerun your unit tests very, very quickly. And it does cater to more rapid development. It forces you to think about what you're developing a lot more. I personally would never go back to a time where I wouldn't use test-driven development with unit testing and integration testing, unless I was writing a very simple app or something that was so challenging to do in TDD that I wouldn't be able to meet a deadline because of it. So again, it's more of a preference on whether you think TDD is important or not, but that is the focus of the enterprise MVVM videos. How is an EF involved here? Again, EF, NAD framework is really only involved in the integration testing aspect of it and the data layers where you have functions like add or delete or update customer. Past that, once you get in your application layer, you would mock that functionality out so you're not hitting the database, but we'll cover that in future videos. The last thing that I'll comment on is development is a drag because of it. TDD is definitely a grind, or can be a grind, but I think programming in general can be a grind, and you have to be able to enjoy it regardless of how painful it is. Otherwise, you won't be successful at it in a career. So I don't know if you're currently working in a career or not, but you have to be able to push through the burnout to do great things. Not all code is going to be the most exciting in the world. Okay, next one from Fark, Google. Not the most appropriate name. I'm a Microsoft groupie, and even I've given up on WPF. It is dead. Everybody wants cross-platform desktop applications these days, and Qt framework is the only thing out there that's half decent. Everything else is HTML5, JavaScript, and ASP.NET. Apparently there's a revamped WPF in the works, but it will just be beating a dead horse. So this is a very hot debate. You can argue that WPF is dead. I would argue that it's not, in the same fashion that Windows Forms is not dead, VB Script is not dead, Classic ASP is not dead, COBOL and a lot of older technologies are not dead. A lot of it depends on the industry that you work in. For example, we develop software for the banking industry at my day job. For my other decom engineering, we do developer tooling. It's just very different depending on the area that you work in. Different teams are different, personalities. It just depends. We currently use WPF applications at work to develop internal tooling very rapidly, whereas we use ASP.NET, Classic ASP for more of our actual flagship product. I've heard in other industries where, like the gas and electric industry, where they need lots of visualizations in their applications, WPF is the thing. So it just depends. It's definitely not the most used technology out there, but it's still great. Microsoft is still supporting it, updating it. And with what they're currently doing, making .NET open source and ASP.NET is now cross-platform, I wouldn't imagine it's much longer till WPF is also cross-platform. So personally, and as far as the cross-platform debate in the arena that I work in anyway, having cross-platform applications isn't even a request. We don't have a single client that's using anything but Windows servers. So we don't have any Linux servers or anything like that. So it's just not an issue for us. So again, just depends on the area that you're working in. And honestly, I think if HTML was more like XAML, it'd be a much better development environment, and it wouldn't surprise me if sometime down the road something like that happened. Okay, let's see, Abdullah Alu. Thanks for sharing. Actually, I want to use the MVVM pattern in AngularJS, and I'm looking for presentations of the pattern and how to implement it in general. I mean, outside the scope of WPF. If you found something like this, thanks for telling me. So this is interesting. First off, AngularJS is a MVC framework. MVC and MVVM are very similar, but they have key differences. If you're looking for a pure MVVM style framework, I would actually recommend Knockout.js. Now, I've used both. Knockout.js was really awesome, actually. The issue that I had with it is I needed many more features than just the data binding. And that's essentially what Knockout.js is. It's just a data binding framework that facilitates MVVM through the pattern of having view models and things like that. I also found the idea of having to do knockout.apply bindings all over the code to kind of be a mess. And ultimately, I transitioned over to using AngularJS, which I found much more intuitive. I kind of fell in love with the framework, and it is a framework, not just a library, which is what Knockout.js is. Knockout.js, you end up having to use other frameworks like Breeze, Require.js, and kind of all that, whereas AngularJS has kind of everything you need in one package. It's documented well. The MVC pattern fits better in, I believe, with ASP.NET MVC. But at the end of the day, that's just my personal preference. So for your question, though, give Knockout.js a try. There are other libraries in Angular, but again, AngularJS is a MVC framework and not just a library. Okay, next question. Jordan Vowinkle. It sounds like you use a mechanical keyboard. If my assumptions are correct, do you think it makes a big enough difference for a programmer to invest in a fairly decent one? So this isn't really related to MVVM, but I thought it was a great question. So I have had a ton of different keyboards. I've had membrane keyboards. I've had Logitech. I forget all the brands I've had, but I've had quite a few. Membrane keyboards are nice because the key presses are kind of soft. They're easy on the fingers, especially if you sit at the computer for a long period of time and program all day. But the mechanical keyboard, I actually use a DOS keyboard with blue switches in it, and it has a distinct click sound when you type on it. Honestly, I won't use another keyboard again. I like it. I can type faster on it. I get more feedback from the keys. It seems kind of silly to think that a keyboard makes such a big difference, but it does. Try it out. They're kind of expensive though. If you want a good mechanical keyboard, you're going to spend over $100, and that's pretty much the gist of it. Highly recommend them though. Couldn't be happier. Okay, Ian Durward, very helpful tutorials. The only query I have is that if you use Fluent API or data annotations with NAD Framework, then you would simply dismiss all the checks on the required fields and simply put a try catch around the customer.add so that NAD Framework does all the validation for you. If the try fails, then simply throw the exception. To me, it seems like redundant validation is taking place. Yeah, that's a great argument. It just depends on the validation framework that you choose to use. In our case, we're not using data annotations or Fluent API for any validation at all, though we could. So we're doing our validation ourselves, kind of using the check required pattern, which again, at our day-to-day workplace, we use that pattern and it has worked very well for us. One of the big reasons that we chose to go that route was we didn't want entities to even touch, at least in the case of adding new entities to the context, we didn't want them to even touch the context if there's validation issues. We've ran into situations where we're dealing with lots of data and the context becomes corrupt, or it's just a pain to constantly write code to detach invalid entities, things like that. So we chose to kind of take our own approach. Looking back on it, you can do it just as well with Fluent API or data annotations. But again, Fluent API seems more popular in the code first world of things, where we're using database first. And data annotations, again, same thing. So it's just something that we kind of shied away from based on our requirements and the comfort that the team had. But ultimately, you can make that decision between you and the guys on your team. Okay, let's see. This one is from I Don't Want a Channel. Excellent series, David. More, please. One question. How do you bind validation to the buttons in is-enabled property? I noticed that the Add Customer button becomes enabled before the email text box has a valid email address. So by default, WPF knows to enable or disable elements when it's bound to a command based on the can-execute method of your iCommand implementation. So if can-execute returns true, the WPF command manager will make sure that the button is enabled. If it's false, it will make sure it's disabled. Now, what a lot of people are currently doing is they will hook into WPF's command manager requery suggested event, which is the wrong thing to do. The reason is it has a unexpected behavior. It has serious performance implications. There's a lot of different technical reasons for it. I won't get too detailed. But what happens when you do that is your can execute gets called whenever WPF feels it needs to. So you don't have control. So even though you may only technically need to call it once or twice in your view model, the WPF command manager may call it 10 or 12 times. So it's just a bad habit. What you want to do instead is call your can execute function yourself from within your view model as needed. And that either approach, whether you choose to hook into the command manager or call your can execute yourself, those two things will ensure that the UI elements respond to the can execute's return value, ultimately making sure that your buttons are enabled or disabled. You should never actually need to data bind the is enabled property for something that has a command binding. Now there's other elements that don't have command bindings, like a list view or things like that, where you can definitely data bind the is enabled, but your logic that determines whether that can happen should probably be in a separate property called like can take some action where that can be shared between both a data binding for the list view that doesn't support commands and your button that supports commands. There's many ways you can approach it. Okay, Stacy Odell, what is the point of moving your external dependencies to another folder when you have NuGet to manage those? Are you trying to account for a team member that does not have NuGet? I love this question. I've got it a lot. Not all dependencies come from NuGet. Where I work, again, we have lots of libraries that cost a lot of money. For example, we use GD Picture, which is $5,000 per license per developer. It's an imaging SDK, not available through NuGet. Lead Tools SDK, same thing. There's just so many different libraries out there that you cannot get through NuGet. And we hate having to manage both NuGet packages and dependencies. So what we decided on was just ultimately to move everything to the dependencies folder. And we don't actually update our dependencies that often. If we have a known good working library, unless we have a very extensive reason to update our libraries to a newer version, we don't. Don't fix what's not broken. So that's kind of one of our mentalities, because it's extra work to update libraries. You have to deploy it, you have to maintain it, you have to version. I like NuGet, but that's one of the reasons that I have that habit of moving libraries out. Now, in one of my current projects, I have a ASP.NET project called Fault Track. I use purely NuGet for that because I don't use any third-party frameworks that aren't available on NuGet. So for that project, it's not an issue. But that's the reason behind that. Again, something that you should make an agreement with on your team that you work with. Okay, Nigel Stratton. I like the straightforward approach to EF and WPF. Many posts build a repository to interface with Entity Framework, but Aonde will shout out that the anachronistic reasons behind the repository. He prefers a simplified strategy and commands. I'll be interested to see how you handle child collections in your next post. For instance, an orders collection on a customer. How you integrate observable collection and EF code first. You don't. Again, you don't modify your Entity Framework models to facilitate MVVM. You wrap them in a facade pattern or another view model, and that's where you do that work. So I may have a shell view model, and maybe it has an observable collection of customers. But instead of using my customer entity, I'm going to create a new customer facade or a customer view model, and I'm going to use that in conjunction with the observable collection on the view model. I would never modify the data layer objects to facilitate MVVM. So hopefully that answers the question. We will have a more concrete example of that when we do get further into the Enterprise MVVM series, because we're going to take what we built. We have a simple CRUD form, and we'll do other things like we actually do have a collection of customer view models, I believe, in the project, and we'll extend on that. So you'll get to see in a future video. So okay, that was the last question, so we'll stop there. If you guys enjoy this type of Q&A, definitely continue to ask questions in all the videos. I don't get a lot of time to sit down and actually do videos and answer questions, but when I do, I will go back for an entire year if I have to and just pick questions out. So let me know what you think, and if you find these videos useful, make sure to like and subscribe and share the videos. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.